Hello and welcome to Speaking Week, and this session focusing on nurses. So if you are joining this session and are not a nurse, then you might want to come back tomorrow if you're a doctor, or on Thursday and Friday for our allied health professions. All of the webinars are being recorded so that you can watch again whenever you want, or if you're unable to stay for the whole of the session. Hello to those tuning in on Facebook. Make sure you register via the link provided there to continue watching. In today's session, I'm going to share a brand new roll card with you, which will also be uploaded to the sample test section of the OET website by the end of the week. I'm also going to share examples of candidates completing the role play with me from around the world. Over the last 2 weeks, I have recorded role plays with 30 candidates from among the more than 5,000 who expressed interest in doing this. It would have been really amazing to speak to even more candidates, and I'm sorry if you weren't one of those chosen. But I'm going to use scripts from the role plays that I did record to demonstrate different strengths and weaknesses against the assessment criteria OET assessors use to mark your speaking test. Let's start with a couple of poll questions, though, to ask you about what you know and do at the moment. So this first poll question, which is coming up for you to answer now, is all about which of the free official OET resources about speaking that you have used. Have you used our speaking masterclass? Have you looked at the sample speaking test we have with feedback? And have you looked at the nursing video on how to approach speaking sample test 3? So let me know in the poll which ones you have made use of already. That's really good to see. So closing off the poll, roughly 30 to 45% of you are saying that you've used some of those resources, but that's not as high as we would like. So if you haven't yet used those resources, please do head over to our Prepare page, our preparation portal, where you can find links to all of those resources using those arrows that I've showed you on the screen. So you can find the video for the Speaking Sample Test 3 in our sample test folders. You can watch the OET Masterclass. You can also sign up with us for OET YouTube to see the sample speaking test with feedback. All right, another question. This time, how often do you practice patient conversations? So there's a few options there, depending on perhaps whether you're working in English at the moment or whether you don't have that opportunity. So let me know how often you practice patient conversations. All right, so again, the answers are pretty evenly spread. So between 30 to 42% of you, some saying I practice every day, and some saying I don't have anybody to practice with. So if you are working with patients in English, then you are lucky in having multiple practice opportunities. Even if you don't, though, there are still ways to practice conversations with patients, which just require a little bit of time from colleagues, friends, or family members. And in the video on Speaking Sample Test 3, which I talked about in the previous slide, I explain how you can do this, even if you don't have a new roll card to practice with. All right, and my third poll question, which I'll just pop up now, is how confident do you feel about the speaking assessment criteria? So how frequently are you looking at the assessment criteria? Perhaps you've never seen the criteria, you don't know anything about them at all. Don't worry if that's the case. Do be honest. It's good to get a sense of how candidates are making use of this really valuable resource. All right, that's great. So probably, as I would expect, the majority of you are saying, I have a general idea about them, but I'm not sure about how I compare against them. And so that's going to be a big focus of the session today, to sort of help you to analyze your own speaking against the assessment criteria. For those of you who haven't seen the assessment criteria, they're so important to your success on test day. And after all, because it's a language test, you're only going to score the grade you want if you evidence each of the criteria to a high level. So if you're not sure what the criteria are or what the assessors are looking for, this is something you really need to fix fast. And this session is going to be a good start, but make sure you visit our website to download the criteria from the link that you can see on your screen now. Save them to your favorites, or print them off and stick them on your wall, ideally with the writing assessment criteria as well. All right, so to score a B grade in your speaking test, which is the score most of you are aiming at, you need to score mostly 5s from the linguistic criteria, which you can see on the left, and 2s for the clinical communication criteria, so a competent user. And I'm going to go through each of these criteria in turn at the level that I'm saying you need to score to get the B grade, and explain it with a bit more detail and show you some examples of what that would look like in terms of speaking. So the first one is intelligibility. So this means your speech is easily understood with what is called minimal strain for the listener. And my best way of explaining strain is the expression on that emoji on the screen, a sort of confused, puzzled look. But the patient or interlocutor might not always show this on their face. It is a little bit impolite to sort of visually demonstrate your confusion. Instead, you can imagine that internally their mind will be turning, trying to understand what you have said. Another indicator that there is strain is if the interlocutor doesn't answer the question as you expect. Perhaps they just say yes, which is something we do in English when we know we've been asked a question, but we haven't understood and don't like to ask what you meant. So also included in intelligibility is how you sound. And it's absolutely fine to have an accent and also to make. So let's look at an example of intelligibility. Here, the nurse has asked a question which is clear because of the way that they've ended what they're saying by "it would be okay with you." And I can hear that that's a question when they say it, but I'm not very clear what the question is because the preceding information wasn't very clear. And so you can see that I just answered as the interlocutor, yes, yes. I didn't really know what the question was. And so that's an indicator that there's been some strain for the person listening. They're not really sure what has been said and therefore what they're expected to do to respond. Let's look now at fluency. So this means that you are fluent at normal speed, and any hesitation is due to the natural process of thinking and speaking at the same time. So you may occasionally repeat yourself or self-correct what you have just said, but the amount of this wouldn't confuse the patient. The words normal speed are important here, and this may be different depending on what you are discussing with the patient. So imagine explaining a process to a patient or giving them results of a test. Would you talk about these at the same speed as you would when asking questions or answering a routine question that they ask you? No, you need to make sure your speed is appropriate for the content and slow down when necessary. So here's an example. Well, this nurse is demonstrating good fluency in that they can manage to continue speaking for such an extended turn. But if you have a look at the topics that they're covering a lot of information without pause. And it was at quite a fast speed, which would be confusing to the patient. You can see that they cover some benefits of the nursing home, but also they touch on what the risks are if they don't have any care, and then how to decide on how to choose a nursing home. It's a lot of information for anybody to process all in one go. So Fluency is about processing, giving the patient or carer time to process that information, not just going very, very quickly through a lot of information. Appropriateness of language, which covers your level of formality, the tone of your voice, and your vocabulary. And these need to be mostly appropriate for the scenario that you are discussing. So formality may be different depending on whether you have met the patient before, according to the background information, the age of the patient, or their healthcare needs. And similarly, you use different tone of voice when you're showing empathy or reassurance to firmly advising the patient to do something. Your vocabulary choices are also linked to the function of what you are discussing. So whether you are advising, asking questions, or reassuring. Occasional mistakes in these areas are okay, but overall you need to match these things well to the role play. So here's an example where in a couple of places the nurse uses some quite technical language, so saturation oxygen, which wouldn't be very clearly understood by the patient. Excuse me. Basic needs is also quite vague to a patient. It might mean something very specific to you as a nurse, but put yourself in the patient's shoes. What is meant by basic needs? Give some examples. So you need to think about whether the vocabulary you use is appropriate for the situation and the person that you're talking to. And then we have resources of grammar and expression. So you are able to show the assessors that you can be flexible with English, that you have the grammar and vocabulary necessary for this situation, and to respond to the patient. And this means demonstrating different tenses, conditional forms, phrasal verbs, perhaps occasional colloquial or idiomatic phrases. But don't think of them as a tick list that you can simply tick off when you have used them once per role play. Instead, they're like a filing cabinet. You pull them out or download them, if you like, when they're needed and as many times as they're needed. Occasional mistakes are okay, but in general, the mistake shouldn't prevent your meaning from being clear or the conversation from continuing smoothly. So here in our example, you can see the patient is able to understand the meaning of what this nurse is saying without difficulty, but there are quite a few errors coming through the speech. So for example, a to option for you at the moment, or there are times when the nurse self-corrects, so you can, you won't. We also wouldn't say send your partner to a nursing home. Perhaps you might say admit your partner to a nursing home or apply for your partner to go into a nursing home. So these sorts of occasional mistakes by themselves in this response wouldn't necessarily have a significant impact on your score. But if this level of mistake was throughout the role play, then that might impact you from getting a 5 for resources of grammar and expression. So let's now look at the clinical communication criteria. And there's quite a bit of misunderstanding about these. So compared to other English tests, these are not criteria you will have been tested on before. You're used to demonstrating all of the linguistic criteria, even before you reach testing standards while you were learning English at school, for example. But not being familiar with them is no excuse. They're not weighted so highly as the linguistic criteria. So these clinical communication criteria are marked out of 3, whereas the previous 4 linguistic criteria are marked out of 7. But there are 5 of these clinical communication criteria, and it's pointless to throw away scores. Another misunderstanding is that they are assessing your medical knowledge. And this is not true. It's probably a misunderstanding because of the word clinical in the title. These are communication criteria in the clinical context, or in other words, important communication skills which healthcare providers need, which are separate to the actual medicine they are discussing. And if we go through them one by one, you should see what I mean. So the first one is relationship building. And the ways that you can evidence this are by starting the role play appropriately, using introductions where needed, or greetings, and perhaps establishing the purpose of the conversation. It's also important to show respect for the patient and their situation, and not judge their opinions or attitudes towards their health, even if you try to change this attitude because it's part of the task during the role play. You need to show empathy for the situation the patient describes or what they tell you, both in the words that you say and in the tone of voice you use in your responses. These approaches to the conversation help the patient feel like you are on their side, that you understand them, and that you will work with them as a team to address their health needs as best you can. So here's an example of a polite, friendly opening to a role play. So you can see that the nurse introduces themselves and summarizes or explains the purpose of the conversation that is about to take place. So the next clinical communication criteria is understanding and incorporating the patient's perspective. So this means asking the patient to tell you about what is worrying them or what they feel comfortable to do. Or if they tell you this information without you needing to ask, asking follow-up questions to make sure you fully understand, or respond in a way to show you have listened by including some of what they say in your response, or an explanation you give later in the conversation. It also means noticing how the patient answers your questions or tells you information. Do they use language to show they feel uncomfortable, anxious, or embarrassed? Do they use words that sound like they agree, but from the tone of their voice show that they don't really? For example, maybe, I suppose so. Let's look at some examples. So here we can see that the nurse shows they have listened to the response by picking up on some of the concerns that were mentioned. So the interlocutor says, I was hoping we wouldn't need full-time care yet, and he's not very keen on the idea of a nursing home. And the nurse picks up on that. Every new environment can be stressful and you will be worried. Providing structure. So this means taking responsibility for the conversation and the content you want to discuss with the patient. There are a number of different ways to do this, including signposting that one discussion point has finished and a new one is starting by naming the new point you want to start talking about. You can also check if the patient requires any clarification before introducing a new point, or just make a clear pause and intake of breath to show a change of direction. Other organization techniques including offer a summary of the process or what has been agreed, or by adding intensifying language such as really important, essential that you do this, to help the patient understand what is more or less important from the information or advice that you're giving. So here's a very clear example. The nurse introduces that she has 3 things to discuss, pauses for the response, and the interlocutor simply says, okay, and then uses the signposts of first of all and secondly to mention the things that they discovered during their assessment. Information gathering. These skills are all about assisting the patient to be part of the conversation. It might seem a little counterintuitive in a speaking test that you should be encouraging the patient to talk more, but it's important that there should be a balance. It's rare when we're speaking to another person that we do all the speaking and they do all the listening. In real life, and certainly with patients, speaking is a two-person process, and we can complete the conversation more effectively if the other person is actively involved in it. To do this, you need to give the patient opportunities to speak by asking open questions first, so they tell you the situation in their own words, before clarifying what they've told you using closed questions. When they're speaking, show that you are listening by not interrupting, providing encouragement through sounds like uh-huh, right, and then responding using some of what they told you or give a summary of what you have understood. It means making sure you have understood what they said by asking for clarification when it's unclear, or, as we looked at above, when their words suggest one thing, but their tone means another. It also means avoiding asking compound questions, which means 2 or 3 questions in one go. So, for example, can you tell me about how long you've had these symptoms, how severe they are, and any medications you've tried? Those are 3 separate questions that have all been asked as one, and the patient or carer doesn't know which one to start with. They're quite confused to have so many questions delivered in one go. You should also try to avoid leading questions which suggest the answer to the patient rather than letting them answer it in their own way. So, for example, you've not had these symptoms before, have you? Is a leading question. It's sort of answering or pushing the patient or carer towards a particular answer. So here in our example, the nurse checks it's okay to talk before asking her open question to hear from the person in their own words. So is this the right time to talk with you? Once that's been established, could you tell me how you are managing since 2 years with your husband's condition? An open question, which is inviting the carer in this case to explain in their own words. And the final clinical communication criteria is information giving. And so in contrast to information gathering, this is about how you speak and provide information in those parts of the conversation where you need to do this, when explaining options, giving advice, and so on. But it's still focusing on how you include the patient in these sections. So, for example, by finding out how much the patient knows already about the topic, so you don't give them unnecessary information, checking they've understood and that you've provided sufficient detail for them to feel clear about the situation. Also asking them explicitly if they feel comfortable with what you have said, and if not, to feel safe to share their concerns. Pausing is important here. You must remember that the situation you were discussing with the patient is likely to be the first time they've heard it, and if you rush through everything, they will miss important details or just end up feeling worried and confused. Watch their face. This is a good indicator of whether they are relaxed because they are following what you're saying, or feeling stressed because you're providing the information too quickly. So here's a nice example from one of the nurses who gives the person permission to stop if they are uncomfortable or dislike their suggestion. So it allows the carer to feel safe to share their concerns if they have them. All right, so now we've gone through each of the assessment criteria with some examples. I want to share with you 5 top tips that came out of completing the role plays with the 30 candidates that I did in the last couple of weeks. So step number 1, how you start the conversation is really important. And if you're not clear about this, ask during the preparation time. Read the background information carefully for clues and make use of those clues once you start speaking. Tip 2, don't rush. The conversation is more important than completing all of the tasks. This is a patient. They need to understand and be included in the decision-making process. Yes, OET is a test, but it's testing you on your communication skills with patients. So it's much more important that you have a good conversation than that you get through all of the tasks. Tip 3, and when we come to look at the role card in a few seconds, you'll see that there's some information on the card provided in brackets. Now, this information in brackets is optional, and you may need to alter it or think about how and when you say it to keep the patient feeling comfortable. If you don't do that successfully, if you just read out the information in brackets, it could have a negative impact on the conversation. So do think about if you want to use that information in brackets and then how you're going to use it. Tip 4, don't add to the tasks. So even if your healthcare training tells you to take a complete history or to ask additional questions, if it's not on the card, you don't need to do it for the purposes of OET. And the final tip is if you use healthcare terminology, make sure you explain it to the patient or check that they are familiar with it, and use lay language, patient talk whenever possible. All right, so let's have a quick look at the nursing role card together. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read through that card, and then I'll pick out some of the key details. Okay, so in this card, the setting is the patient's home, and the background information, which I've highlighted for you on the card, tells us that the patient has COPD and requires continuous oxygen. It also says that you have just completed an assessment of the patient's needs and are discussing full-time care options with his or her carer, which we can see from the previous sentence is the patient's spouse, who has been caring for him or her for the last 2 years and has recently gone back to work. So when we come on to look at the examples in a minute or two, you will see that who the nurse is talking to did cause some confusion for the candidates I role-played this task with. And I'll give you some examples of how some of those coped with that better than others. So this card has 5 tasks, and again, I've highlighted the important details. You'll notice that I haven't highlighted the information in brackets because, as I've just mentioned, that information is optional and you can use it, but if you are going to use it, there's a good chance that you will need to alter it in some way to make it suitable for the patient, or in this case, the carer. So the 5 tasks are to find out how the spouse has been managing, to reassure the spouse about his or her situation and explain your assessment of the patient, to outline options, including the option of the spouse giving up work again, to explain the benefits of a nursing home, and finally to advise on choosing a nursing home and to suggest local nursing homes for considerations. So for the second half of this webinar session, we're going to go through these tasks one by one and look at some examples from the different role plays I recorded to see where there were some strengths and weaknesses. And perhaps later in the week, when this role card becomes available on our website, you can also complete this task and record yourself doing it, and then compare your performance against the strengths and weaknesses that I pick out on the card or in the examples from candidates today. So as I mentioned, a few of the nurses were unsure about who they were speaking to, having read the background information. I would say this is pretty unusual for an OET task, but it could happen. So the point I want to make is that I would encourage you to do like most of the candidates did and ask during the preparation time if they are unsure who they are talking to. One nurse didn't do this and thought she was speaking to the patient. So had read the background information and had misunderstood, thought she was speaking to the patient and so started the role play in this way, as if she was talking to the patient, which was quite confusing for me as an interlocutor. But let's look at how a couple of the other nurses used the preparation time successfully. So you can see here that both nurses clarified if the interlocutor was the patient or the carer. So this is during their preparation time. They both checked, are you the carer or the patient? The nurse on the right said, do we meet before? This isn't something the interlocutor can answer for you, but as you can see, I directed them to have a look at the background information, and then the nurse was able to answer their own question, I've met you before. And then after they have clarified who they're talking to, they also asked what name they should use for me as the carer of the patient. So that's a really good way to make use of your preparation time. If there's anything that you're unclear about, make use of that time to clarify it with the interlocutor. Don't be embarrassed to do that. It can cause problems for you. As I mentioned, the nurse that didn't ask and assumed they were talking to the patient, that causes its own problems. So it's much better to ask and to feel comfortable about the situation before you start. One candidate didn't do the right thing, which is, as you can see on the screen now, she waited for the preparation time to end before asking the question. So as you can see, the interlocutor says, can you start the role play now, please? And at that point, the nurse says, I have a doubt. Am I talking to the patient or the spouse? And that's not what should happen. When the interlocutor says start the role play now, you need to start the role play. So make sure you do ask any questions that you have during the preparation time. So I'm now going to show you 4 other examples, and I'll give you a little bit of time to read these on the screen. Here are 4 other candidates starting the role play. Have a look through them, 1 to 4, and maybe type into the chat box, what do you think was positive about the different ways of starting the role play? Or perhaps which one, 1, 2, 3, or 4, do you think was the best way to start the role play? So just mute myself for a second so you can read and tell me in chat which of those options do you think was best. Okay, so some of you are suggesting number 2 was the best option, somebody number 3, somebody number 1, somebody number 4. So we've got everybody covered, but it looks like 2 is very popular. Great. So the best one here was probably number 3. And that's because, or I'll just talk about number 2 before I go on to number 3. So number 2 is not so successful because the nurse says, would you mind if I examine your spouse now? But if you remember from the roll card, it was saying the background information says you have just completed the assessment of the patient's needs. So that's not a good match for the background information. But number 3, this nurse did ask me to confirm my name, which you would imagine we would have already done, given that she'd already examined my husband. But she did then get straight onto the reason for her visit and the first task, which is how I've been managing in the last couple of years. So let's look at task 2. So the second task was to reassure the spouse about his or her situation and to explain your assessment of the patient. Now, Some candidates did the first part of this task really well, but others skipped it completely. And you can see the ones that did it well on the screen now, and I've highlighted the language that they used to demonstrate that they were reassuring the spouse. So you can see the nurse on the left, Anne, had this lovely phrase to say, I have to congratulate you because you were doing a fantastic job with him, because the way you were taking care of Mr. John is so excellent, because I can see he have made some more improvements in his conditions. You're doing it perfectly well. So that's a lot of nice reassurance to the spouse about how they're caring for them. And the nurse on the right, also not quite so long, but also covered this task well. So actually, I think you already done all you can. I can reassure you that you already really manage your situation really well. So it is important to pick up on all parts of the task and to demonstrate this different language that the assessors are looking for. If we compare it to these three examples, these three candidates make no mention of reassuring the spouse about his or her situation. They do show empathy to what the spouse has said, but this isn't the same thing as what we saw on the previous slide, which was giving that obvious and clear praise to the spouse of a job well done so far. So there are some differences, and missing out that task means a missed opportunity for you to demonstrate some of those communication criteria which the assessors are looking for. It wasn't really a surprise that all of the candidates felt quite comfortable about tasks 3 and 4, which were to outline the options for care, so full-time carer or nursing home, and to explain the benefits of a nursing home. These tasks probably felt very familiar and were tasks where less involvement was required from the spouse, which is why some of the nurses gave quite lengthy answers. So again, I'm going to show you some different options. There's 5 to choose from this time. And don't just, this time, don't just tell me which number you think is best. There are strengths to all of them, but perhaps type into the chat what you like about each one that you see on the screen. So if you have a look at number 1 or you look at number 2, what do you think is good about how they've outlined the options and explained the benefits of a nursing home? So I can see a lot of you saying that you like number 2. Somebody saying 2 is not overwhelming. It lets the patient speak. Jackson says it looks more interacting. Brigitte mentions that full details of the benefits of a nursing home are provided. You can definitely see that. They talk about physiotherapists and dietitians as well in there. So yeah, some good suggestions about the differences between 1 and 2. Let's have a look at the other 3 examples. So all of them are doing exactly the same task, and it just demonstrates how different candidates do things differently. And there isn't a perfect option or a right or wrong answer necessarily. The way we speak and interact is very different. It's a personal thing. But what do you think are the strengths or weaknesses about these 3 options? So these ones are 3, 4, and 5. I can see some more responses still coming through for the first two. But what do you think of these 3 on the screen now? Some of you saying that you like number 4. What do you like if you think number 4 is a good option? Again, someone saying 4 looks like more interaction. 3 is giving some recommendations. Yeah, we can see that in the second section. Lots of positives for number 4. Great. So I'll just explain a little bit about each one. So in number 1, the first one, the response was quite long. It was difficult to follow and it didn't involve the spouse. So a lot of you picked up on number 2 being much more interactive than number 1, which is correct. So although there was lots of detail given, it was, as somebody listening to the nurse, quite difficult to follow. It was a little bit too long. Number 2 does give some good benefits about the nursing home care, as some of you picked out, and it is supportive about the difficulty of the decision. But it didn't cover both of the options. It only talked about nursing home care as an option. So the 2 options were full-time carer or nursing home. So this one only focused on the second option, but it does give some good benefits about that nursing home care. Number 3 covers all 3 of the options completely. So it does talk about that could be full-time care or full-time nursing home. They also mention maybe consider keeping your job, and I'm not sure whether it suits you. So they completely cover all of the tasks, and then a little bit later, after the spouse has responded, as many of you picked up, they also give some good benefits of nursing home care. A lot of you like number 4. Number 4 approached the first task a little differently, so giving the options rather than just telling the spouse what the options are. Number 4 asked questions. Would you prefer him to be transferred to a healthcare facility, or would you prefer somebody to come to your home? And that's completely fine. That's perhaps a good way to ask the spouse first, what is your preference, rather than just saying, these are the choices, what do you think about it? So that's absolutely fine, but it's a little bit different to how the other candidates covered it. The last nurse didn't really cover the options that were available and only provided a couple of benefits for the nursing home. So that was a bit of a weakness for that nurse in those tasks. So task 5, which was to advise on choosing a nursing home, not all candidates made it to the final task, which is okay. As we talked about earlier in my top 5 tips, it's much more important to have a good conversation than to complete all of the tasks. So if the previous 4 tasks have taken up all of the time, you've been responding to the spouse's concerns, it's been a really good conversation, then that's not a problem. However, if you spend time at the beginning of the conversation asking your own questions or things that weren't part of the tasks, that's not so good. So you do need to plan your time and stick to what is on the card to discuss it. But if you don't get through everything, don't worry, don't panic. It's definitely about the conversation that you have. So on this slide and on the next one, I've got a candidate on the left who gives a more detailed response to how to advise on a nursing home, and a candidate on the right who only gave a limited response. Now, the limited responses aren't necessarily weaker than the more detailed responses. It's just that once each of those limited responses had finished, that was the end of the role play time. So once they'd said their question, I had to say thank you, that's the end of the role play, because the 5 minutes are over. So have a look at these different options. Again, do you think one is better at answering this task, which is to advise choosing a nursing home? Which one do you think, left or right, is better in your opinion? Don't worry, I haven't gone anywhere if you're worrying that the audio has stopped. I'm just pausing to see whether people think the left or the right option is better. So we've got a couple for right, a couple for left. All right, so there are, as I said, there are some positives about both of these ones. So the nurse on the left, her suggestions, her advice is to read some information as well as to organize a visit and to contact her for more information. The nurse on the right probably was feeling that she was running out of time at this point. I think the more that you practice doing the role play for 5 minutes, the more familiar you get with how long that feels like when you're talking. And so the nurse on the right was probably running out of time. Her speech wasn't all that fluent for this response. So for these two, I would say that the option on the left was stronger with all of the different ideas and suggestions that they made. But here's two more. Again, one is longer and one is not so long. But of these two new ones, again, left or right, which one do you think is more successful? All right, so again, I think people are suggesting the one on the left is a bit more successful. This one's not quite so clear cut, I would suggest. So the nurse on the left suggests a brochure and a visit, as well as also making a list of requirements to find something suitable. But the nurse on the right, even though it's a much more limited response, does mention making a list of requirements and visiting a home to speak to the staff. So they do cover the task adequately in the amount of time they spend talking about it. And perhaps it's a clearer explanation because it is shorter at the end of the day. So there are different ways of completing each task. There's no, as I said, no sort of set way that you should present the information, and it's all about how you are engaging with the patient or carer and having that conversation with them. So having looked at some real candidate responses to this role card, in summary, every candidate will have different strengths and weaknesses. So what is really important is that you evidence the criteria to the assessors. Understanding what they are looking for is a really valuable part of your preparation. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, you must go on to the OET website and download or save those assessment criteria so that you are looking at them regularly. There's no way that you're going to score really well on the test if you're unaware of what it is that the assessors are looking for. And particularly with the clinical communication criteria, which are different to any other language test that you may have tried before. It is important that you don't throw away marks there. You know the sorts of things the assessors want to see, and so you can provide them in your role play. OET is a language test though, so you are not being judged on the accuracy of the medical information you provide. And that's something that I think quite a few candidates do get worried about. But the good news is this is a language test. So if you're not familiar with the situation, you don't need to worry too much. The information that is provided on the card is sufficient for you to be able to complete the tasks. And finally, to remember that your assessment is across both role plays. So you have the opportunity to make up for some of your weaknesses in the first role play when you're completing the second. So don't panic if you don't feel like you've been able to demonstrate all of the assessment criteria really well in the first task. You'll have opportunities to sort of improve your score for some of those criteria across the second role play as well. So that leaves us with 10 minutes for me to answer questions that you might have about the speaking test. So if you would like to ask me a question about speaking, perhaps about something that I've discussed on the session tonight, then please add those questions to the chat box. And just for the last 10 minutes or so, I will answer the questions that you have about speaking. So Jackson saying, do we act like we know all of the background information in a known case? Yes. So as I sort of pointed out with the background for this one, it said things like, you know that the spouse has been looking after the patient for 2 years. You know that the patient has COPD. You've just completed an assessment. So the most successful candidates that did this task were showing that they had read and understood that information, and were starting off by saying, you know, how have you been managing since the last time? Or I know you've been looking after your husband. How have you been managing it? So yes, exactly. You can use the background information to start the role play. Somya is saying, is it compulsory to confirm the name if the patient is known to me? So the answer to that is no. So as I mentioned, again, with this task, it clearly says that you've just completed an assessment of the patient. And that's why the candidates who use the preparation time to ask, what name shall I call you? What is the patient's name? Were able to very successfully start the role play using that information. So if the background, the case suggests that you know this patient, then you don't need to confirm the name at the start of the role play. Joanna is saying, will this be recorded? So yes, this session has been recorded, and any candidate that registered for today's session will be receiving an email after the session with the link to the recording so that you can look at it again. Mary says, do we need to finish all of the tasks given? So that was one of my top tips, that the conversation itself is much more important than finishing all of the tasks. The tasks are there to make sure that you have enough content to talk about for 5 minutes. But the priority is that you communicate well with the patient in English, rather than rushing through things so that you complete all of the tasks. So yeah, that's good. If it's a follow-up, you don't need to introduce yourself again. Archie says, do we need to sympathize with the patient's concerns for the whole test time? Definitely, showing empathy is one of those clinical communication criteria about patient relationships. So certainly if the patient is expressing a concern or telling you something that's worrying them or something they feel uncomfortable about, it's definitely good to show sympathy and empathy throughout the role play. It's one of those things that you shouldn't just treat like a tick. I've done that, I don't need to do it again. As you would in real life, you should show as much empathy as needed to the patient throughout the time that you are talking to them. Ikimba says, could you please explain about the points in brackets? Do we really need to mention them during speaking? So as I mentioned, again, this was one of my top tips. The information in brackets is there to help candidates. So, for example, if in this task, which was about COPD, if you didn't know much about what an assessment of a COPD patient might mean, then you wouldn't necessarily understand that they would need round-the-clock assistance and constant monitoring. So that information is put in brackets so that you can then complete the task, which is to explain your assessment of the patient. But you don't have to use that information. It's there for you to go, okay, I understand now what sort of things that I need to discuss when I'm explaining my assessment. But if you decide to put them in your own words or to include other suggestions, then that's absolutely fine as well. The information in brackets is optional. And my advice would be, if you are going to use it, to think about how you use it. Don't just read it out. It's something that you, again, need to put more into your own words so that you're having effective communication. Thota says, if we don't know something in the cue card, can we ask the interlocutor? So absolutely. And I think this task was a really good example of that, where some of the candidates were a little bit confused about the situation. And so those candidates that asked about it during the preparation time were then much more able to get started on the conversation successfully. Don't be embarrassed or feel shy about asking the interlocutor. You can ask them, you know, what name shall I use for them? What does this word mean? How do I pronounce this word? And so definitely make use of that if you want to. J3 says, can I use idioms like feeling a bit under the weather, down in the dumps, to get off your chest? So these idioms are certainly expressions that patients would be familiar with. Some of them are more appropriate to a healthcare conversation than others. So a bit under the weather is one that I would say would be appropriate. But down in the dumps, or to get something off your chest, are perhaps a little too informal, because obviously you're having a friendly conversation with the patient, but you should still maintain a degree of formality to demonstrate professionalism. So there is a difference, obviously, between patients talking to themselves or a patient saying to you that they feel down in the dumps, and the language that you would use in return to demonstrate your professionalism. Jobin says, do I need to maintain eye contact with the interlocutor during speaking? This is certainly nothing that you are assessed on. The assessors are only listening to an audio of your recording, so you definitely don't have to maintain eye contact. But what I would say is, if you can maintain eye contact, or at least look up and look at them now and again, is that it reminds you that this is a conversation with a person, and hopefully you can try and imagine that this is an actual patient. So it is sort of helpful in that regard to try and make some eye contact, but it's not something that you are assessed on. Gina Lynn says, is there a chance that an interlocutor will not be cooperative with the role play? For example, during information gathering, the interlocutor will not talk much. So it's an interesting choice of words, not cooperative. So obviously when you're doing your role play, you have your card, but the interlocutor also has their card, and some cards do give the interlocutor sort of instructions about how they should respond to the patient. It might say, for example, be reluctant about what the nurse is telling you, or be unconvinced about what they're saying. So it could be that they're not actually being uncooperative. They are following their card, or they are just genuinely taking the role of a patient, because some patients don't have very much to say, or they don't know enough about their own health needs or condition to be able to give you a very long answer. Or by some alternatives, some patients are very talkative. And so that's exactly as it is in real life. And interlocutors are trained to try to mimic real life. So you will find that some interlocutors are quite chatty, some interlocutors are not very talkative, and that is just how it is in everyday life. And you're not penalized for the way that the interlocutor completes their side of the tasks. You are simply assessed on the way that you complete those tasks with them. All right, I'm going to answer 2 more questions and then we will draw this to a close. So let's have a quick look. I'll just answer this as another quick question. So Sheila says, do you have a similar live class for doctors? Yes, the doctors class is tomorrow. So you can still sign up and attend the doctors class tomorrow. Lindsay says, while speaking, should we imagine that we are in the same situation and talking to that person? Absolutely. I think that's a really good strategy to follow. So really do try to put yourself in the patient's shoes and think about what would they want to know, what language would be appropriate to talk to them. And that might also help you to show better empathy when you are talking to them. Okay, I can see Anne has repeated her question many, many times, so I'm going to answer Anne's question, which is, do we need to use complete sentence and grammar? So you need to obviously use effective grammar. As I demonstrated, that is one of the assessment criteria. And it doesn't have to be as formal, complete sentences as it is in writing, for example, but it is important that you are clear and that you are able to answer all of the tasks. So it doesn't have to be complete sentences, but the grammar should be reasonably accurate, and also that you are able to clearly communicate the information to the patient. All right, thank you so much for joining me today for this nursing session. If you are a doctor or one of our other professionals, you don't need to register again. You should get a reminder before tomorrow's session, which is at 12 o'clock Australian time. So do look out for that session. We'll also put a live Facebook reminder that the session is about to start. So look out for that if you don't get the email reminder coming through to your inbox. If there are some doctors here, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. But to the nurses that joined today, thank you so much. It's been lovely to have this session with you. Have a good evening. Take care. Bye for now.